So, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could all say, my life has turned out exactly the way I dreamed? Thank you for that laugh. I appreciate it. I venture to guess that there's not a soul in this room who could say that. And I also don't think we can say that until we're in heaven standing before our precious Father, because I don't think there's a time we can say that. Because our life is full of struggles, painful childhood, broken relationships, financial stress, a bitter divorce, loss of a loved one, devastating diagnosis, rebellious child, or just plain deep disappointment. The wounds of life are many. And sometimes they seem to come upon us one after the next and feel relentless, like they won't let up. And we may find ourselves thinking, what did I do to deserve this? Or, where are you, God? Or, why? Why is this happening? And I think that most of us in here have lived long enough to realize that pain is just a part of life. And I sometimes also wonder if, as women, it's more prevalent in a woman's life. And it may be just because women talk about it more. It could be because women have this need to sift through what's going on in their life to understand it better, so that we can learn from it and find a reason for what's going on. It could be that we hold out higher expectations, and then we crash lower when our dreams are dashed. But whatever it is, from the deep ache of abandonment or rejection or lost love, or maybe it's just the sting of an insult from somebody that you thought was your friend, we feel pain living. And what we want to do as Christians is to be able to rise above whatever it is. Sorry, missed that. What we want to do as Christians is to rise above whatever it is that has scarred us and come out the other side stronger. We want to be more confident. We want to be more secure. We want to be more faith-filled. We want to be more of a blessing to the people around us. What we want to do as Christians is to say, I trust God. I trust that He has a purpose. I trust that He has a plan for everything that I've experienced. What we want to do is to be able to look back on His loving hand in our lives and say, He was there, and He brought me faithfully to wholeness today. So, whatever you're dealing with, and we all deal with things at different seasons in our life, whatever heart-wrenching difficulty has engulfed you, I can tell you with all of my heart that there's an answer and that there is healing. I have seen women find purpose in the pain that they're in, and I've seen women who have turned away from their bitterness as they look to Jesus. We spent a good deal of our year last year, just on a series of lessons called Getting to Know Our God. And we're not even halfway through what I have planned. And obviously, we could spend the rest of our lives getting to know God, and we should be doing that. But there's no doubt whatsoever that getting to know God will increase your faith. It has mine, absolutely. Because when we learn that our God is sufficient, He's enough. He is all we need. He's holy. He's trustworthy. He's glorious. He's sovereign. He is in control. He is always present. He is the most powerful being ever. He knows everything. He is always good. And He loves you, and He will never, ever, ever leave you. The very thought of God just passes our wildest dreams. And we're told to seek Him every single day of our lives. And as we seek Him, He reveals more and more of Himself to us. And as He reveals Himself to us, we fall more and more in love with Him, especially as we see Him working intricately in our lives. So that when things get difficult in our lives, Without knowing and understanding God, we see punishment instead of God's provision. If we don't know God when we're going through a difficult time, we see reasons to become bitter instead of his blessings. And we start to feel very out of control when we don't know God. Or maybe we become very obsessed with control, trying to control our lives and also the lives of people around us, because we totally forget that God is the one that's in control. We feel shame and we feel guilt instead of his powerful love and forgiveness. We are insecure and self-conscious instead of confident in the one and only lover of our souls. So one of my favorite characters in the Bible, I love Joseph. And talk about him a little bit today. Joseph is a beautiful example of how God's purposes can turn out for our best. We can find this story of Joseph in the book of Genesis. So if you were able to talk to Joseph today and say, what was your life like when you were growing up? He could have said, I had a very dysfunctional family. Joseph was the son of Jacob, and if you remember our studies on Jacob, Jacob had a lot of his own problems. Jacob was a bit of a wimpy mama's boy who deceived his brother and tricked his father and then ran for his life. And I could go on because there's a lot of problems. Jacob had 2 wives and 2 concubines, and he had children with all of them. And if you read through the account in Genesis, you'll find out that there was a lot of jealousy and there was a lot of misery in that household. And this is the household that Joseph grew up in. Joseph was born to Jacob's favorite wife. And of course, you remember that he wanted to marry Rachel, but Rachel's father tricked him and he ended up marrying Leah. Anyway, Joseph was the favorite son. So starting in Genesis chapter 37, verse 3, and remember, Jacob's name was changed to Israel. So when I say Israel, we're talking about Jacob. Now, Israel loved Joseph more than any of his sons because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a robe of many colors. And when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all of his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peacefully to him. So are you sensing some of this dysfunction? Joseph could say, if you ask him, my brothers hated me. They sold me into slavery. And then I was accused of doing something I didn't do and got put in prison. My life was a mess. But he didn't say any of those things. He never, ever described his life that way. He never pointed fingers at his brothers. And he never started with the, where was God complaint. Instead, from a palace throne, Joseph summarized his life by recognizing God's providence and his goodness. And what you and I might consider to be a big mess was actually a masterpiece. God had worked through very, very difficult circumstances in Joseph's life to orchestrate purposes for not only Joseph, but an entire race of people. So let's go back a little bit more and look at this story. Joseph had 10 older brothers and 1 younger brother. There were 12 brothers altogether. And because Joseph had 10 older brothers and 1 younger one. And because Jacob favored Joseph and spoiled Joseph, the older brothers were very jealous and they were mean to him. The scriptures say over and over, they hated him. Jacob seemed to be oblivious somehow, makes him this beautiful ornate coat, did not make a coat for his brothers, and all of the hatred just seemed to escalate and elevate when Joseph decided to tell them about his dreams. And in Genesis 37, starting in verse 5, it says, now Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. And he said to them, "Hear this dream that I have dreamed. Behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and behold, my sheaf arose and stood up straight. And behold, your sheaves gathered round it and bowed down to my sheaf." And his brothers said to him, "Are you indeed to reign over us? Or are you indeed to rule over us?" So they hated him even more for his dreams and his words. And we know he had other dreams as well, where he dreamed that his actual parents and brothers would be bowing down to him. Can you imagine the nerve that he had of telling his brothers, who already hated him, "Hey, one day you're going to bow down to me"? And apparently, this was the last straw for his brothers. And we're going to pick up reading in Genesis chapter 37, verse 12. Now his brothers went to pasture their father's flock near Shechem. And Israel said to Joseph, Are not your brothers pasturing the flock at Shechem? Come, I will send you to them." And he said to him, "Here I am." So he said to him, "Go now and see if it is well with your brothers and with the flock, and bring me word." So he sent him from the valley of Hebron, and he came to Shechem. I decided to stop and look at a map and try to figure out how long of a distance he was traveling. And what I found out was the distance from Hebron to Shechem was just about exactly the same distance as it is from Wasilla to Anchorage, about 48 miles. So I thought that was interesting. And it probably took him a couple of days to walk. And of course, we're talking about not a nice little pathway. He's going across wilderness. So he gets to Shechem, and a man finds him wandering in the fields, and the man asks him, "What are you seeking?" He said, "I'm seeking my brothers." And he said, "Tell me, please, where they are pasturing the flock." And the man said, "They've gone away, for I heard them say, 'Let us go to Dothan.'" So Joseph went after his brothers and found them in Dothan. So he goes all that way, and I just think we could talk all day about who in the world this man was that would know, but that doesn't matter. And now he has to go another 12 to 15 miles to Dothan. And I can just imagine, after traveling across this wilderness, it's probably scary, probably, difficult. I'm sure he was in anticipation, excited when he finally saw them up there. I mean, we've all lost a child and in a store or something, and you can feel that, and you finally find them again. I'm sure he was just feeling that, there they are, He doesn't have a map or GPS or cell phone or anything. He's going across wilderness looking for his brothers. So he gets up he's walking from a distance. His brothers see him. And the scripture says in verse 18, "The brothers saw him from afar, and before he came near to them, they conspired against him to kill him. And they said to one another, 'Here comes this dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. And then we will say that a fierce animal has devoured him, and we will see what has become of his dreams.' But when Reuben heard it, he rescued him out of their hands, saying, 'Let's not take his life.' And Reuben said to them, 'Shed no blood. Just throw him in a pit here in the wilderness, but don't lay a hand on him, that he might rescue him out of their hands and restore him to their father.' So when Joseph came to the brothers, they stripped him of his robe and the robe of many colors that he wore." Now remember, he's just walked over 60 miles. He's probably hot, he's probably tired, he's probably hungry, he's probably weary. And they stripped him, grabbed him. In verse 24 says they threw him into a pit. The pit was empty and there was no water. Then they sat down to eat. They didn't offer him any food. And looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead with their camels bearing gum, balm, and myrrh on their way to carry it down to Egypt. Then Judah said to his brothers, "Hey, what profit if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he's our brother, our own flesh." And his brothers listened to him. Then the Midianite traders passed by. They drew Joseph up, lifted him out of the pit, and they sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver, and they took Joseph to Egypt. I can only just begin to imagine that the pain and the horror of this experience. Being carted off to a foreign country where you cannot speak the language, you're sold as a slave, there are no privileges, you know no one, everything's difficult. I think the emotional trauma and pain would be off the charts for me, and I'm sure it was for Joseph. Without an exception, Jacob, and I'm sure that nobody was back there thinking about him or missing him. Nobody was missing him except for Jacob, of course. And Joseph knew this. He knew that it's his brothers that did this to him. It was his family that did this to him. He knew it, but he also knew that God was with him. So Joseph had now traveled another 300 miles. It said they probably took him about 15 days. And as a slave, they didn't give him a cushy seat on some camel. He's probably being dragged behind. It was not an easy situation. Now, when he got to Egypt, a man named Potiphar, who was a high official of Pharaoh, bought Joseph from the Ishmaelites. In verse 2 of 39, the Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man. And he was in the house of his Egyptian master, and his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord had caused all that he did to succeed in his hands. So Joseph found favor in his sight and attended him, and he made him overseer of his house and put him in charge of all that he had. And from the time that he made him overseer in his house and all that he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. And the blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in his house and field. And so he left Joseph in charge, and because of him, he had no concern about anything except what he ate. Joseph began to work for Potiphar, and it became very clear to Potiphar that his God was with him. Now, Potiphar did not know his God. Nobody in Egypt knew the true God. And eventually he puts him in charge. So if you were taken as a slave and put into this kind of a position, how would you respond? I mean, I would venture to guess that there'd be a lot of griping and complaining. I know I would just be thinking a lot of things. We like our comfort. We don't like to be uncomfortable. I mean, what if somebody said, take your cell phone all that way and you can't ever look at it again? I mean, we'd go nuts. We don't like it if our food's not hot enough, or if our shower's too cold. We are quick to complain about simple things, and I just think I have the hardest time wrapping my brain around what is actually going on with him, and that he is not complaining. He's trusting God and rising up. So the very next verse says, now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. One of the things I want us to stop and remember is that Joseph was 17 years old when he got sold into slavery. 17 years old. And Genesis in 37, we have this young, good-looking, good strapping young man. And the following verses tell about how Potiphar's wife was very attracted to him and repeatedly made sexual advances on him, put him in a very difficult situation. And he repeatedly resisted the advances that she made, and he said, there is no way I'm going to go to bed with you. I am loyal to my master. And he said, how in the world could I do this wicked thing in front of my God? Joseph was always remembering God when he was in this situation. So, of course, out of her anger and her outrage, she framed him, accused him, and Joseph gets put into prison for doing nothing, just for doing the right thing. There's nothing that gets our ire up more than having somebody say something false about us, looking bad in other people's eyes. We always want to look good in people's eyes. But Joseph was falsely accused and thrown in prison. So while Joseph was in prison, he became a model prisoner and soon was put in charge of the prison. And Genesis 39:21 says, but the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love, gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison put Joseph in charge of all the prisoners who were in the prison. And whatever was done, he was the one who did it. The keeper of the prison paid no attention to anything that Joseph was in charge of, because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made to succeed. We don't know exactly how long he was in prison. We don't know exactly how long he was with Potiphar. We do know that he was 17 when he was taken into captive, and he was 30 when he came out of jail. That's a lot of years. That's a lot of years. And while Joseph was in prison, we know that he ended up interpreting dreams for a cupbearer and a baker. And he said both men had formerly served the Pharaoh. And the cupbearer, which is also in some versions called a butler, he says to him, in 3 days, Pharaoh is going to lift up your head and restore you to your office. He tells him in verse 14, only remember me when it's well with you. He says, do me a kindness to mention me to the Pharaoh, so that get me out of this house, for I was indeed stolen out of the land of the Hebrews, and here also I've done nothing that they should put me in this pit. Remember me. But the cupbearer forgot him. The scripture says that Joseph remained in prison for 2 more years. Then Pharaoh had a dream. And so, and none of his wise men or magistrates or anybody could interpret the Pharaoh's dreams. And then the cupbearer said, oh yeah, there was that guy in prison. And so he told him about Joseph. And so Pharaoh brought Joseph out of prison, and Joseph interpreted his dream. And Pharaoh was so pleased with his ability to interpret his dream. Joseph gets promoted to second in command over all of Egypt. And ultimately, it was because of Joseph's supervision of the grain in Egypt and his position of authority that he was able to spare the lives of his mother, his father, his brothers, and an entire nation of people. Joseph had been through a lot. And now he gets to meet up with his brothers again. And his brothers did come. And his brothers did bow down to him, just like the dream said. Think about what you would say to your brothers after everything they had put you through. This morning I was thinking about this, and I thought, he knew nothing about them. He knew the evil that they did. He didn't know if they had ever repented. He really didn't know where their hearts were. But he did forgive them. And to me, the most remarkable part of this entire story, we need to remember he's a very, very powerful man. He could do anything he wanted when his brothers showed up. He could have thrown them all in prison. He could have had them all executed. He could have done anything he wanted. But Joseph's legacy, in addition to sparing the lives of his nation, of the nation of Israel, his legacy is summed up in his statement to his brothers when he saw them face to face. And he said, as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good. None of this would have happened if he hadn't been taken into slavery and had endured all of this injustice, real physical and emotional pain and stress. Yet behind the scenes, God was working, and Joseph knew it. God had a tremendous plan that would place Joseph in a far better place. I ran into this scripture recently, and honestly, it knocked my socks off. I still just kind of walk around a bit stunned by it. In Psalms 105, listen carefully, verse 17, it says, it's talking about God, and it says, he had sent a man ahead of them, Joseph, who was sold as a slave. His feet were hurt with fetters, and his neck was put in collars of iron, until what he had said came to pass, and the word of the Lord had tested him. And the story goes on. It tells the story. The psalm goes on. And it just gives me chills to stop and consider God's sovereignty in Joseph's life. God is in control. God sent Joseph ahead of his family so that he could be there in Egypt to save their lives when the famine came. I'm certain that Joseph couldn't have dreamed that in a million years when he was being carted off as a slave. You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. And instead of resenting their actions, he recognized his brother's foolish actions, motivated by jealousy and rage, were used by God to turn his world around and serve a bigger purpose. He recognized that his life was not about pleasure, but it was all about God's plan. And whatever you're going through, and I know not everybody in this room is going through a big struggle right now, but we will maybe tomorrow. But whatever it is that you're going through, whether somebody has directly done something to you or indirectly, God can still use it for good. It's possible that God is reshaping your character in the middle of your pain and preparing to raise you up for a greater purpose. Sometimes we struggle to see what the greater purpose is. Sometimes we just can't even imagine what that greater purpose is. But what we need to remember is that just because we can't see it and just because we can't imagine it doesn't mean God is not working in a greater purpose. Joseph couldn't see hope sitting in a prison cell, but God saw Joseph's faithfulness in every situation he was put in. Joseph waited for God, and Joseph trusted God, and there is no doubt about that. And his reward eventually came. So how did Joseph do this? He had to have known the character of God. He had to have. He had to have had a relationship with his God. He had to have continued to seek God daily. He was in a place where there was nobody that knew his God. He wasn't getting encouragement anyplace else. He had to have continued personally seeking and talking to God. Joseph knew and trusted God. And when we're struggling in our life, we don't have to understand the whys of what we're going through. But it's essential that we trust the one who in love is allowing whatever hurt it is to happen. Because as you trust his goodness and his love and his overall purpose, and allowing whatever has happened in your life, you grow and develop into the woman that God wants you to be. It's through our struggles that we're strengthened. Everybody in this room has struggled. I mean, when we look at Joseph, he was not a superhero. He was just this normal, ordinary person. And we've all struggled. It's just important for us to remember in our struggle that this life is not about me. This life is not about me, and it's not about you. It's about what the sovereign God of the universe decides that he wants to do with one woman who's willing to stand up and say, "Not my will, but your will be done." It's not my comfort, it's your cause. It's not my desire, it's your delight. Can we say that in the middle of our pain? Can we say, well, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good? I started this lesson by talking about how important it is to know our God. It's so important to know our God. It is so important to know our God. Joseph couldn't have done this without knowing God. He couldn't have. He had no place else to get the information. He had to have known God when he went into this. And we can't do it without knowing God either. We cannot go through the struggles of our life without knowing God. We're going to continue throughout the year talking more, getting to know our God. But that's not enough. It's not enough. I want to challenge you. I want to challenge you to make this year, 2020, like no other year you have ever had in your Christian walk. Spend every day in prayer and in his word, seeking the Father. Get to know the Father like you have never known him before. Because there is truly, truly no pursuit in this life that's more worthwhile. And then, maybe then, you too will find the purpose that God has for the struggles that you are going through in your life. So, thank you.